Good morning, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about something that doesn't always show up as yelling or obvious conflict. It shows up quietly. It shows up as distance, as numbness, as we're fine, but not close. As living together, but not really feeling close together. Today's question that we're going to ponder today is, why do I feel disconnected from my partner? If you love them, if nothing catastrophic happened, if you're still functioning as a team, then why does something feel off? Well, here's the honest answer. Disconnection isn't random. It's actually psychological. And most importantly, it's relational. And it's usually cumulative. So let's slow this down and unpack it in a way that makes sense experientially. So first, disconnection often begins with these micro moments, not major events. Now, obviously, major events can be a part of this, but most couples think disconnection happens because of infidelity or some sort of major betrayal, a huge conflict, or even trauma. And sometimes that is true. But what I see more often is that disconnection happens in micro moments. So, for example, the sigh that goes unnoticed, or the bid for attention that gets dismissed, or even the vulnerable comment that gets problem solving instead of understanding. And so the stress that replaces curiosity tends to occur. So when we think about emotional connection is built in small moments, and it erodes in small moments. And so it's not one explosion, it's often 1,000 missed turns towards each other or even bids of affection. So you stop feeling chosen, you stop feeling seen, you stop feeling emotionally prioritized. And ultimately, the distance is going to grow. So what people come to me is that they often report, we're talking, but I'm not feeling felt. And many disconnected couples still obviously communicate. They're just not communicating in the way that actually lands. More often, they're successful in communicating schedules, for instance. They're capable of discussing logistics. They're able to problem solve. They're able to parent. They're able to generally function. But the emotional attunement is actually quite different. And it's actually quite different from the operational communication that many couples are successful in. Disconnection happens when you speak, but you don't feel understood, or you share something personal, but you feel minimized, or you express emotion and you get correction or defensiveness instead of empathy. So feeling connected really requires this emotional resonance. Honesty, for example, without attunement often comes across as aggressive. And so examples of these types of comments might be something like, I see what this actually means to you, or I understand why I hurt you, or your thoughts, your feelings, your perspective actually matters to me. And without that, the conversation actually becomes quite transactional. And unfortunately, this is where we get into the conversations that lend to kind of nuanced concerns, whether it's taking out the trash or doing the dishes or who feeds the dog. These transactional experiences can often seem like that they're the main focus, but truly it's the process underneath. And so when relationships are transactional, the relationship actually, and the person in the relationship eventually starts to feel lonely. And your nervous system ultimately becomes out of sync. And so, when we think about connection in and of itself is biological. And when couples ultimately feel connected, their nervous systems regulate together. And when they feel disconnected, obviously we're dysregulated. And unfortunately, this is where we can begin to show up in our relationship very much reactive. So one partner may actually pursue harder, or one partner may withdraw, or one partner becomes critical, or they both become avoidant ultimately. And as I explain this to couples that I see, this isn't a personality problem. And so if you feel disconnected from your partner, or you ultimately just feel disconnected in your relationship, ask yourself, when I reach, do I feel rejected? And when I express frustration, does my partner shut down? When they pull away, do I escalate? Disconnection often comes from a pursue-withdrawal cycle, where the more one pushes for closeness, the other ultimately feels overwhelmed. And so they tend to withdraw even more. And so the more one withdraws, the more the other one feels abandoned. And so neither feels understood. Unfortunately, this unrepair leads to continued conflict, and it ultimately accumulates. Conflict itself doesn't create the disconnection, because connection or conflict is actually a natural part of a healthy relationship. But unrepaired conflict does. And so if after arguments there's no ownership, or there's no softening, there's no clarification, and there ultimately isn't that emotional repair, then unfortunately that's where resentment tends to compound. And so you might think that we moved on, which is often the sweeping the issue under the rug, but more often what that represents is the couple's inability, or the person's sense that resolution is not possible or even a priority. And over time, people start to think, do they really get me? That they don't care how that impacts me, and it's always me sacrificing or adjusting. And so ultimately, disconnection is unresolved hurt that was really never metabolized between the two of them. And so people often outgrow their old dynamics. And so, this one is subtle, is that sometimes disconnection happens because one or both partner are evolving, for example. And so your needs at 25 are not the needs at 40. And you may now want more emotional depth. You may want more intellectual communication. You might want more shared meaning, or more sexual alignment, or more autonomy, or more partnership. And so the list goes on based on what the individual's needs are. And so if growth isn't discussed, then the relationship can ultimately freeze. And in an early version of itself. And so ultimately, when one person evolves faster than the other, the relation system can actually adapt. But that requires both partners to actually talk. And so if they don't adapt and they don't have these conversations, then they ultimately begin to feel alone. And even if love is still present, unfortunately, that love can ultimately erode over time. And so disconnection is sometimes really a misalignment. It's not a lack of love. And so when we feel misaligned, we'll often enter into these kind of protective modes that will replace vulnerability. And so when people feel hurt, they repeatedly attempt to protect themselves. So instead of saying, I miss you, or I feel lonely, or I need reassurance, they'll say things like, you never listen, or you're always on your phone, or you don't care. And so criticism is often disguised as a longing, and withdrawal is often a fear in disguise. And so control is often anxiety in disguise. And if both partners can say in protective modes, no one feels safe enough to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is the gateway to connection, then obviously we need to develop a different process. And so you stopped turning towards each other. Connection requires adaptive participation. It can't be one over the other, and you can't overcompensate for your partner. And really, the small things matter when we're engaged in these types of conversations. Being in attunement or being present is really important, such as eye contact, even physical affection if appropriate, checking in with each other, establishing these shared rituals, humor, play, curiosity. These are the transactions that research has even shown that over time, healthy, long-lasting relationships require these positive inputs. Unfortunately, obviously, over time, life can crowd this out. As life moves on, we have to consider our careers. We often have kids. Obviously, there's stress, even phones, and just life fatigue. And what I find is that people don't intentionally disconnect. They just stop intentionally reconnecting. And, due to the priorities of life, learning how to shuffle what's important to us can become quite challenging. And ultimately, when we talk about intimacy, whether it's emotional or physical, that requires intentionality. And so if you feel alone in your inner world, this is really the deepest layer, is that disconnection hurts because it touches our attachment, right? At the core of humans, we want to feel seen, we want to feel chosen, we want to feel safe and heard and valued, and we want emotional prioritization. We want to feel special and important. And when that experience ultimately fades, people will begin to question, do I even matter here? Am I important? Sometimes I get the question of, well, am I too much for my partner? Or am I asking for too much? And ultimately, are we drifting apart? And so disconnection isn't just about behavior, it's about attachment security. So you might ask then, why do you feel disconnected? Well, usually it's not just one thing, as mentioned before. It's this constant missed emotional attunement, or there's emotion system dysregulation, or there's a series of unrepaired conflict, evolving needs that haven't been discussed, or there's a constant protective defensiveness that's now patterned into the relationship, and even a lack of intentional connection. And so the longer it goes on unnamed, the more normal it feels, until one day somebody says, I don't feel close to you anymore, or I don't love you. Now, there is good news, right? So disconnection is not the same as incompatibility. And often folks will arrive asking, are we compatible? And I say, no, it's often a signal. It's a signal that something needs to be repaired. It's something that needs to be spoken and named, and it's something that needs to be softened. And sometimes it's needs that have evolved that need to be named and spoken of. So connection can be rebuilt, but it actually requires a few things, such as slowing down, emotional honesty, obviously accountability, to be able to internally emotionally regulate. As I've said, if you can't emotionally regulate, you can't communicate. And so there's a curiosity instead of defensiveness that needs to occur as well. And obviously constant repair and checking in. It requires you to say, something feels off between us and I don't want distance, I want us. That's encouragement. We want to encourage each other to open up and to be vulnerable when we are not feeling good. And that's ultimately relational maturity. And so before we close, I want to leave you with 3 reflective questions. So the first question is when you feel disconnected, do you move toward your partner or away from them? Notice your pattern. Awareness is the most important step. The second question is, in your last disagreement, was there true emotional repair? Or did you guys just move on and sweep it under the rug? Because repair determines the longevity of the relationship. And if you're honest, have your needs evolved? And have you clearly communicated that evolution to your partner? Unspoken growth creates silent distance. And if this resonates, obviously you're not broken. Your relationship isn't necessarily doomed, but disconnection becomes disconnection entrenched. And so that can continue to, unfortunately, evolve into a pattern of just really more disconnected patterns. Again, connection requires intention, and intention begins with awareness. So again, if any of this resonates with you, your relationship isn't necessarily doomed. It just means that you two are out of alignment and attunement, and you may need to seek professional help. Until next time.